Hello, hello, beautiful listeners. Let's do this, shall we? Okay, so in today's podcast, we are talking about something, asking questions, that is a core part of the craft of coaching. So when I think about the last decade plus that I have been doing this thing called leadership coaching, executive coaching, vision coaching, one of the core tools that I am leveraging in every coaching conversation that I have is asking powerful questions. Why are we talking about this in the context of design yourself? Well, in order to be able to bring ease to the way you work, in order to be able to see with clarity what is your purpose, what is your vision, and how do you move towards that in the present moment, we've got to be able to listen deeply. And the quality of our listening, which also means the quality of what we're hearing, what we're able to take in, comes from the quality of the questions we're asking. And that might be the questions we're asking ourselves, might be the questions we're asking of others, individuals, and also teams. So it is in that spirit that I want to empower you with some of my best of when it comes to asking powerful questions. So here's the two things that we're going to look at in this podcast today. I'm going to start by laying out core distinctions around the types of questions, and then we're going to look at a context for how you can put these questions into practice. And in particular, we're going to look at what does it look like for you to ask questions of yourself? What does it look like for you to ask powerful questions in a one-on-one setting? And what about when you are in a group setting or team setting? Okay, so let's dive in. Okay, so first we're looking at types of questions, and we're going to talk about three core distinctions. What questions, how questions, why questions. I know when we're going through our elementary school and we learn also who, when, but today we're going to focus on what, how, and why. What questions at their core are opening up and expanding our possibility? How questions are at their core putting us into action? What are we doing? Expanding. How do we do it? Driving to action. Feel the difference? What is possible? How do we make that possibility happen? What, how? What, how? Why questions? Of course, the question why we could argue, Simon Sinek does a good job of this, is the core question of purpose. Know our why. I'm not talking about it in that context. I'm talking about it in a conversation with others. When you ask a why question, it's often disguising poorly, might I add, some kind of judgment. When we ask a why question in a conversation, it tends to put people on the defense. And let's practice it. I'm even going to say this. I'm centering myself in a neutral way. Why did you do that? Do you feel that? Why did that happen? Why didn't you tell me? Versus, what kept you from telling me? Right? Do you feel that difference? Why versus what? So, I'm going to give us a little bit more context around this. Let's start with what. So, what questions are not, I'm talking about, yes, they're expansive, but that doesn't mean that they're all lofty and big picture questions. You can ask what questions that expand the sightline and still have them be very action oriented. So, for example, you might ask, what's your best thinking on this topic? What are three possible solutions? What's our best path forward? See how that does move us to action, but it's helping us generate the possibility of it. What are we really talking about here? So often I notice in conversations, and I'm going to put this into a team context, the thing that we're missing is being clear on what's most important for us to talk about. And when we don't know what's most important for us to talk about, because we're so focused on how do we get it done, we are driving to action, but without a clarity of are we focusing our action on the thing that matters most? And that becomes really exacerbated in heavy meeting cultures where we are gathering together because we have systemic things that we need to work together to do. However, we are not clear on what's most important for us to focus on. It can also happen in the course of our own lives. We're so busy dropping into how do I get everything accomplished? How do I manage what's on my plate? That we're not actually clear on what's the most important thing for me to focus on right now. So if I were to prioritize what, how questions, you want to be clear first on what, and then critically drop into how. Last thing I want to say around the what, how questions is just to notice when you are in dialogue with yourself and with others, what kind of questions are being asked. Now, I have the gift in my coaching life that I will hear clients come in and say, well, as I'm thinking about what I want to focus on, I'm wondering about this and what about this? And I want to ask myself this. And I'll hear, are they in a lot of how questions? You know, what I want to focus on today is how do I make sure that I'm making the right decision? How do I make sure that I get my partner on board? How do I make sure that I don't drop the ball on this really important thing on my plate? And I can step back from that and say, pause. I'm really noticing you're asking a lot of how questions. Seems like it's really important for you to get to action. What's important to you about getting to the action? And again, then we can move from there depending on what their focus is. But I just want you to hear that. It's you can start to listen for what kind of question are we asking. Similarly, lest it sounds like I'm biased toward the what question, can happen in the reverse. You might notice that you have a client who's like, I'm wondering what my purpose is, and I'm wanting to focus in on what's most important for me right now. And I'm not even sure I know what what to focus on, right? What? It's like I'm noticing that you're asking a lot of what questions. I'm wondering if we might find a way to drop in and in one of those questions get you to action. So you can start to feel how to be in the action of that what question. Okay, so what questions expanding, how questions moving us to action, process orientation. Why questions, this is not exclusively the case. However, I'm going to name it because I've been paying attention to questions for over a decade, and I do notice that why questions are often what questions with judgment. So usually they are questions where we're trying to expand to get to something, but we have an ulterior belief of what it is or a frustration around it, and so we just ask why. And so I want you, if you are practicing, which I know you're going to go forth and do, if you're practicing asking powerful questions, then I want you to notice what does it, uh, what might it look like for me to just ask what questions and how questions, and notice without judgment if I ask why, but try and check it at the door. Okay, so test that. Those are the distinctions I want you to have around types of questions. Now, let's talk about how you put this into practice. And let's start with yourself. I would love to see you take 60 seconds and just write down all of the questions that you're holding. Just lay them out. What are all of those questions? And simply beginning for yourself to journal, to reflect, to meditate on what are the questions that are emerging can be incredibly powerful in helping you see where your attention is naturally going. I will do sometimes with coaching clients as a warm up reflection, I'll ask them to do mind emptying. So maybe they have a big career transition that they're moving through, or maybe they were musing on a really emotionally laden topic, and I just want them to take some extra space around it. Sometimes there's a lot of story or context that they're holding coming into a coaching conversation. And so to warm them up for that, I say, okay, let's mind empty. And a way that you can do that is to mind empty again by laying out all the questions. So that's a really great way for yourself to start practicing these questions, is to notice without judgment what are the questions that are emerging. Now, if you want to take it up a notch, 2.0 questions for yourself is maybe you think about, what are my most important questions? And what are the how questions that sit or pair with that what question? So it might be, what's my purpose? How will I put that purpose into action? How can I realize my purpose? Because that's a pairing of a what and how. So you might play with that too. That's a way that you can bring these distinctions into your own practicing of questions just with you and yourself. Now, let's talk about this in a one-on-one context. So, you with another person might be a direct report, could be a friend, could be a partner. Um, Two things I want you to think about here. One, you can simply change the kind of questions you're asking and see what happens. Another flavor of this is maybe you notice that you don't tend to ask questions. You tend to make statements or declarations. Okay, notice that without judgment. Start asking questions and then leave space. So you're asking the question and you're actually allowing space. Take that breath. Let the space be there for the other person to fill in the space. What I think you will find happens is that when you ask questions, you will talk less. And if you can really listen deeply once you've asked the question, so just notice without judgment if you start daydreaming or you're writing a list or you're rehearsing what you're going to say next or any number of other listening blocks that might show up, that can get in the way of somebody sharing their answer. And if you can really ask the question with curiosity and listen, and maybe there's something that they say that you want to ask another question, great, follow that curiosity, ask that next question. What I think you'll find is that it will change the tenor of the conversation. And I also want you to think about, in that one-on-one conversation, what kind of a conversation am I in? And is there permission I need to ask? So I know when I'm in a coaching conversation, that is a very specific kind of conversation. And I am setting it up that we have some ground rules on what that means. What does it mean to coach versus consult versus to counsel? And if you move into a conversation with your friend and you haven't asked for permission to try out a new way of being in dialogue, it can feel weird. And if you have a habit with your direct report of always directing them and not asking questions, you might just say something like, I'm really practicing what it's like to ask powerful questions. And I wonder if you would be game if I tried that here. And the reason I feel safe trying that here is I really respect you. And also, I think on this topic that we're discussing, you're going to have the best answer. And so I want to hear what your best thinking is. Are you game if I set a timer for 10 minutes and try it out? That's what it could look like. Okay. So you're trying that in the context of your one-on-one conversations. Okay, last one. Let's talk about what might this look like in the asking powerful questions in the context of a team conversation. Similar to the one-on-one, but now it's on steroids because we're talking there's so many different personalities, people in the conversation. You want to think about the framing and even beginning to think in your agenda what you're talking about in a team meeting, for example. You might think about what are the core questions that we want to move through? And notice, are there actions we're expecting to take? So, do we need to get to a decision? Okay, then a what question might be what's the way we're going to make that decision? Um, a how question might be how will we handle conflict if it emerges? Or how do we invite conflict to make sure we have diverse perspectives represented? So you can really think about an agenda and begin to ask what are the questions and framing that sits underneath. So that's one tool I would use when you're in a team setting. Now you might say, okay, well, that's one kind of group. What if I'm with my family? Maybe it's a little less formal, though I do sometimes have agendas with my family, but maybe that's a consequence of having a mom who's and a wife who's an executive coach. But I do think it can be really powerful just to say to your family, in this conversation, I'd love us to be really curious and for each of us to go around and pick a question that we want to ask. And we'll all ask a question and we'll all give our answer. Or maybe it's, I'll ask the question of one person and then they'll pick a question to ask someone else. So you can play with it that way too. Um, in the professional setting of your work teams, if you can get to asking powerful questions together, you will accelerate your path to your goals. That's the magic of it. And it will feel different because when we're not asking powerful questions and we're jumping straight to action, we run the risk that we are hopping on a hamster wheel and we are spinning wildly, but we're not going anywhere. And by asking the important, powerful questions, we disrupt and give ourselves a chance to focus back in on what matters most. And that, dear listeners, is what I wanted to share with you today. um, I also want to say a big thank you. Anyone who has joined recently on the Overcast app, and I know you're out there, thank you. I'm thrilled that you're here. And I also want to say thank you to those of you who've been reaching out to me. It's been so fun. I've had live conversations with some of you who have reached out. I've appreciated the emails you have shared. And I thought what I would do, let's see if I can pull it up here, is just share one recent review that came through. And this came through. This is a public review, but this is from a person, and you know who you are, who also reached out over email. We had a chance to connect, and it was such a delight to hear what is drawing you in and what you're finding useful in the podcast. So, this listener shared in a recent review that this podcast keeps me focused and in the moment. And this listener wrote, I look forward to her podcast each week. Her voice and perspective has been refreshing and has helped me focus on my presence in the office and life. I would highly recommend subscribing to her podcast. And thank you. I have my palms flipped up receiving. So thank you for the kind words and open invitation. Whether you are someone new listening on the Overcast app, you have been here a long time, but maybe have never reached out. know that I would welcome, welcome, welcome hearing from you. I am learning so much in these conversations. And as I have returned to the podcast back in the fall, and now I have now over 150 episodes, 100 over 150 freaking episodes. I also, I'm getting my groove back into what I want to focus on, what feels most useful to you, and I really take your input to heart. So just know that if you are having an observation, maybe something sparking, maybe you have an idea, send it on my way. And in the meantime, know that I will be here cheering for you, believing in you, and holding my deeply held belief that there is nothing stopping you. So go on ahead and get after whatever it is that you really want.